Hi, this is John Cutler. One thing that I've noticed is that people get very confused by product management. But I want you to think about this thought experiment. Let's think about all the things that might influence the role of a product manager in a company. One, does the company even sell a product or is it a tech enabled business? What's the product stage? What's the region of the company that was founded? What's the region that the customers exist in? Or regions? What's the company stage? Is it B2B, B2C? The size of the company, the size of the group, financial position of the company. Is it doing well or is it hurting? What's the competitive landscape? What's the relative competitive position of the company currently? What's the stage of funding? Who's on board? Who's on the board? Who is on board too? Overall investor expectations. What's the engineering culture, especially around engineering management? What is the culture in sales and in marketing and support? What's the staff turnover? Have people only been there on average 18 months? What is the past experiences and beliefs of early hires? How about the founders? Does it incentivize individual projects or team projects? Is it functional or is it business line? What is the profile of the customers? Are you selling to consumers out in the world or to people in governments? How many customers do you actually have? How many users do you have? Are you selling your product to people for millions of dollars or $0 plus ads? What's the buying complexity? What's the number of segments? Do you plan to expand geographically? Does your product need to be heavily customized every time it's purchased? Are you planning to do a lot of mergers and acquisitions? What's the regulatory and compliance landscape? What's the health of your tech stack? Is it even working? Is it saddled with debt? Are there a bunch of dependencies? Are you able to measure anything? You get the point here. This is a massive list of things. I want you to think about each of these things will impact the product management culture within a company. So what it gives you is something like this. Like, let's say we combined all those dimensions and we said, um, what companies are similar to other companies? You'd probably get something like this. And you might have all these little clusters of different types of companies. And depending on the elevation of what you were doing, you might zoom out and say, well, actually, there's only three types of companies, these companies, these companies, and these companies. And you'd be necessarily vague if you did that, or you might go in deep and you might find all these different clusters of companies. This is why product management can feel so messy sometimes and wonky. um, which means that when people are giving product advice, they sort of have a challenge, right? There's context-free advice and contextual advice and directional advice and actionable advice. Directional context-free advice are books that are like, here's the 20 principles. Or sometimes the whole world just needs to do this. I guess that's actionable. Context-free actionable advice are best practices or things that people tell you, well, try it, but you're going to need to customize it. Contextful directional advice or heuristics. When in this situation, which would be when in this context, this is what you do. And actionable contextual advice are going to be playbooks. In B2B SaaS, in this setting, here's a playbook for doing these different things. So when you're looking at the product advice landscape and you're looking at this stuff and say, well, why can't people just decide on what product management is or what does a product manager need to do? Realize that you're dealing with all these clusters and you're dealing with different types of advice. There's no silver bullet here. You can't give context-free actionable advice and have that replace contextful actionable advice. Meanwhile, in the whole market, you're seeing adoption of all these things. This is a funny technology adoption in US households ranging from flushing toilets to having a landline. And you can see the progression. Some things take 50 years, some things take 2 years. In theory, it's supposed to be speeding up at the moment. But right now in the product landscape, you have companies that are still operating like it's 2005 and some that are trying to push the limit, trying to operate like it's 2025 or 2030, even though it's 2024. So in the midst of all this, you're having these level of adoption here. Why does any of this matter? What I've noticed out there is that people assume that because product management seems complex, that there's no shared language, people can't define it, it's different everywhere. They assume that that means that somehow product management is flawed or that there's this, if we could just define product management or if we could just use a silver bullet to explain it, then everything would be okay. But what I think is that this doesn't mean that it's too hard to learn. It just means that you need to take a different approach. product management is behaving exactly as one would expect in terms of its stage of evolution and the dimensionality that I mentioned before. This is a feature, not a bug. So what this means is that you need to shift your learning strategy if you're trying to learn product management, from formal mentorship to guided mentorship, from one-way teaching to two-way apprenticeship, from classroom learning to hands-on shadowing, individual learning to collaborative sense making, structured career paths to exploratory role growth, from rote learning to learning with real world challenges, from following instructions to interpreting principles in context. I'm not making all this stuff up. These are learning techniques that have always been used throughout history when you're dealing with something that's more emergent that requires more contextual understanding. So instead of thinking, well, okay, product management must be fundamentally screwed up because no one can define it and it's not like how it works in my company, the correct conclusion here is, wow, product management is what we might expect with all that dimensionality and the speed of adoption across the landscape. I need to refocus my learning methods. So hopefully this has been helpful. Thank you.